So if we talk about Asian countries' foreign policy to the Middle East, probably we should talk about China and India's foreign policy separately. From what I know, China's foreign policy to the Middle East is becoming more and more pragmatic, and it's more issue-oriented rather than state-to-state connections. So nowadays, the biggest initiative is the issue of infrastructure building. So that is related to China's One Belt, One Road initiative that passed by all the Middle East countries.
So when you talk about China's state-to-state policies, how does it, interact with Iran without quite upsetting Saudi, or vice versa? Because China just opened its one of its railway terminals, right? Like last year, I believe, in Iran, and China is also extending its hands towards Saudi. So, how do you think this plays out? I mean, I'm just curious here.
Yes, that is a very good question. But as I said, actually, China's foreign policy is less state-to-state approach. It's becoming more issue-oriented. So in terms of issue, China can say we're building infrastructures. So building an airport or terminal in Iran or a port city in some other countries, this is issue-oriented rather than, we can only be friends with Iran and not the Saudi Arabia.
Yes. Just basically looking at it as an economic or a business issue rather than, more of a political.
Yes,
point
yes,
to
definitely.
With either of
yes,
these. Yeah.
That's why what I say at the beginning, the foreign policy is becoming much more pragmatic. Yes.
Yeah. In the case of India, it's slightly different because India has had relations with most of the Middle Eastern countries for a long, long time. I mean, ever since India became independent, and I think the first country which had diplomatic relations in a formal sense with post-independent India was, Iraq, and the relationship has been, more or less of imparting skills through the exchange of officers, military officers, fighter pilots, naval officers in the 70s and the 80s, but also capitalizing on earlier practices of trade. So not to leave aside oil. That was the policy towards Iraq. With Iran, the relationship has been on and off. It has not been very consistent, but there's always this cultural side to the story because of cultural ties from the 12th, 13th century onwards, resulting in cultural exchange programs in the early 2000s and so on. With the Gulf, it has a very different kind of a relationship because of the large diaspora in the Gulf, and also its need for oil. So I think India has a more broad but also a deeper kind of links with different countries in the Middle East here.
Which country in the Middle East is the largest oil exporter to India?
It's Saudi. Yeah, and then Qatar is its biggest
natural gas.
Yes.
Yes, that's similar with China.
Yeah.
China's started importing oil only from after 1993, when China became a net oil importer, because China itself had a lot of oil reserves before, but the economic development has becoming so fast that it's running out of oil. So that has the economic interest of importing energies from the Middle East has been one of the major reasons of driving China's pragmatic relations with all the energy exporting countries in the Middle East, including Libya. And I assume with the migration of these different waves of labors, go together with them will be the various Indian culture, food. Could you elaborate a little bit more on that?
Okay. I think if you ask me, and you travel across the Western Indian Ocean, the food is not very different, in many parts of Asia and Arabia. So you have you have the same kind of bread called, by different names.
Pita.
Yeah. And then you have meat preparations, same kinds of spices and herbs used. Also, dates, which is like someone was telling me, you cannot celebrate Eid in parts of Western India without dates, and these dates always came from Iran and Iraq. And the centuries-old tradition of shipping rice and tea and wheat and sugar from India to parts of the Persian Gulf, with oil migration kind of further consolidating the ties between these two regions, it grew to include consumer products. Textiles also was a big thing even from very early on. I mean,
talking about dates, I have an anecdote, and this really shows the difference between Chinese food culture with the Middle Eastern food culture. In the 1960s, when China was building, during the Cold War period, China was building relations with pro-Soviet countries in the Middle East, and Iraq was one of them. And at the time, China's foreign policy was very Cold War ideological driven. So in order to build diplomatic relations, China imported a lot of dates from Iraq, although we really don't eat that kind of dates.
Okay.
So this really shows the difference between the Chinese food culture with the Middle East. And I remember living in Cairo, people always ask me, so what is that tofu thing? So this really shows that actually for China to really sell its foreign policy and to people and to win the hearts and minds of the Middle Eastern people, it's actually a lot more difficult for China to achieve this goal than for India, because naturally the Indian Ocean cultural zone is there.
I mean, did you try telling them that tofu is just soybean cheese?
Yes,
because
I,
Egyptians love their cheese.
Yes, I have to, give them analogy that this is more like soybean cheese. But although, Egyptian farmers grew soybean, but they never really learned how to eat it. That's one of the things that did not take off as it should have been to benefit the ordinary peoples of the region.
Shuang, now that you say that there's a big difference between how the Indians made incursions into Arabia through their cultural practices, particularly food, and the Chinese found it difficult, although the Egyptian farmers grew soybean. I was just thinking, I mean, there are lots of Muslims in China. You have the Hui Muslims, you have the, Xinjiang Muslims and all of that. So and I'm sure there's a concept of halal in China among these Muslims as well. So has there never been any kind of interface in that sense? Because, even if you go on, the Gulf Airlines, you would have, most food is, like all food is certified halal. And then even though, an Indian is non-Muslim, he would be happy to have halal because, there are lots of things that he can eat. So similarly, do you have that kind of a commonality between the Chinese Muslims and the Gulf? I mean, in terms of, can there be?
Yes. There are actually. This is actually initially started by Chinese Muslim students who went on to study in Cairo at the Al-Azhar University in Cairo. It's one of the oldest universities in the Islamic world. And also from the Chinese Muslims who went on Hajj to Mecca. And some of them just later stayed there and never returned. So from those Chinese culture are introduced to, for example, to Egyptians via these students' connections. But these are much smaller proportion of the large Chinese population. Okay. And they are more usually concentrated in the area that is close to the international dorm area of Al-Azhar University. Actually, I've done some ethnographic interviews with Chinese Muslim students who are opening restaurants for hand-pulled noodles, and that because they are Muslims in China originally, and those restaurants seems to be very well received among the Egyptian population. Well, if we say the authentic Chinese food would have a more difficult time to attract local clientele. Yes. And in terms of the halal industry, actually, one interesting thing is halal food is becoming more and more popular in China, even for
among the Chinese?
Yes, even for non-Muslim Chinese, because on the one hand, this was the exotic thing, especially now because of the trade of merchants from the Gulf or from Syria, from different regions of the Middle East come to China to do trade and live in China. And some of them open restaurants and even built mosques in a small tiny city, for example, called Yiwu. So on the one hand, it's these exotic flavor, exotic things that attract non-Muslim Chinese to go to eat these food, and on the other hand, it's also with the knowledge from Muslims, Chinese Muslim living in China as well, and their hand-pulled noodles is very flavorful and it's very well received even among non-Chinese Muslims. So there is actually a growing process of the Chinese government trying to regulate the whole halal certification process, but it's an ongoing process. I'm only describing the phenomenon that ordinary Chinese, Han Chinese like myself, really like to go to a halal restaurant because it's something exotic and tasteful. Yes.
When you talk about the quality of products and the Arabs not taking so well to many of the products, despite the fact that a lot of it comes from China into markets in Dubai and places, I was thinking of the situation with India. The Arabs, like I said, have this relationship of trade with India going back to many, many centuries. And something that strikes me in particular was how the dish dasha worn by Arabs, kind of was, the cloth was made in textile mills in Bombay. Yeah. And you have different grades of cloth. So then a particular grade of cloth was set aside for Iraq, a particular grade was set aside for Dubai, for Oman. Maybe the grading did not happen within the country itself, I mean within India itself, but traders who kind of linked, mostly the Indian Bania merchants who linked the two spaces, Bombay and Gulf, had a clear sense of which grade to sell where. And all the textile shops and warehouses in Dubai kind of graded them accordingly and then shipped them to different places. So when I was talking to many of these traders in Dubai and places like Oman, they were telling us that initially we were kind of strong in the market because there were only Indian textiles. I mean, there was Japanese and American rayon also, but it was not so much the Arabs that liked the Japanese and the American stuff, it was the Indians who worked in the Gulf that took back Japanese saris. Yeah, so there were saris made in Japan for Indian women.
Okay.
And, they were
And then Indian will also sell the Indian textiles to the Arabs.
to the Arabs. Yeah, so all this
Global circulation of
yes,
commodities.
Yes. So all this happened in places like Dubai, which makes it very, very interesting. So I was, you know, talking to some of these textile merchants in the Dubai area, and they were showing me a long piece of cloth, you know, wrapped on that pole that you have. You can see them arranged like in stacks in Dubai. So they were showing me one particular piece, and they said, you know, the name of this piece is Mahalakshmi, which is very Indian, but it's made in China. It's bought by the Central Asians, and we are here in Dubai selling it. So you have the whole world around this one piece of cloth. Yeah, so the shift in the quality of products and the markets is something really interesting when you look at from the perspective of Indian merchants who have been in the Gulf for a very, very long time.
To your knowledge, do you have an idea of made in India kind of product has what kind of reputation in the markets in the Middle East?
One of the things is we don't really sell, you know, huge industrial goods in India. So Indian cars will never make a dent in the Persian Gulf market.
Yeah. Actually, Chinese cars made a dent.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So that will not happen. Trucks, no. You know, so heavy goods, industrial goods were not quite on the table for, you know, the Gulf, in so far as India was concerned. It was mostly these luxury goods, you know,
Luxury
cloth
goods,
and gold. In the sense, India didn't have gold, so the gold went from the Gulf to India, and they came back in the form of jewelry. And the goods that India sends to the Gulf, like I said earlier, is not always targeted at Arabs themselves. It's for others coming into the Gulf to buy them as well.
It can be the Russians.
It can be the Russians, yeah. So even diamonds, you know, came from Dubai to India, partly Gujarat and Bombay mostly, and then it was polished and then sent back to Dubai. Some of it was sold in Dubai, and the rest was exported to Belgium, you know, for trade. So those kinds of goods India has been able to. So those are mostly niche markets. So it's not that India has its reach everywhere in the Gulf. So yeah, I mean, I think to an extent the Arabs also think that, you know, you cannot buy Indian cars, you know. They're not good, yeah. When you have the German cars, you know, or the Japanese and the Korean cars, you would not go for an Indian car. Yeah, yeah, that's mostly the approach. But again, in terms of food, yeah, so you need Indian mangoes, you need your wheat, you need your sugar, you need your tea. All those things, yes, Indian. And they are like rated quite high. So the dimension of, you know, being exotic still exists in many ways. Shuang, you were earlier talking about, you know, Chinese students going to the Middle East, you know, going to Cairo particularly, and coming back and imparting religious knowledge through probably speeches, sermons, texts.
Or working as an imam, or in China's case, is working as an ahong in a mosque.
Yes. Yeah. So there must also be some exchange of, or there must be some investment in, you know, the Arabic language in China. And you also said that, I mean, China established language teaching institutions in the Gulf. So when did China deliberately embark on that policy of cultural exchange, like establishing language institutes in the Gulf?
In the Gulf, it's much
In
later.
the Middle East, yeah.
But in the Middle East, actually, the earliest Chinese language instruction institute was established in Egypt, actually, in Cairo, Ain Shams University in the 1950s. So that was a long time ago. That was mainly because of the Third World movement. At the time, Egypt and China and India as well was all have this fraternal brotherhood kind of working together. So that was the initial impulse of setting up such kind of language institutions. But later it was, you know, especially after the 1990s, it was because more and more trade was going on between the two regions, and because of trade, you will need interpreters who can translate. So now China has set up the Chinese language teaching institutions in all the Middle East countries. And fun fact, the majority of, at least in the case of Egypt, most of the Egyptian students who study the Chinese language, when I asked them, what made you want to study the language? They would say either to work as a translator for these trading companies, because translators paid much better than, you know, other jobs in economy that is not very good in Egypt. Another one is working as a tour guide for Chinese tourists going on vacation in different parts of the Middle East.
But did Chinese tourists go to Egypt even in the 60s and 70s?
No, I'm saying that
it's
after the 1990s. And nowadays, because with the rise of the middle class and Chinese consumers can afford to go out go abroad for tourism, for vacations. So a lot of the Middle Eastern students who studied the Chinese language for the purpose of working as a tour guide for the huge Chinese tourists. A third reason would be Chinese government does give scholarship for students coming from different Middle East countries, including Yemen, Syria, Libya, to go to study in China for a degree. For example, I've met students from Yemen speak fluent Chinese, studying medicine in China. Yes, so these are the three major reasons for Middle Eastern students to study the Chinese language. Yes.
Okay, so the Chinese language can be an entry point into other professions as well.
Exactly, yes, yes. A lot of them, because of the economy in their home country may not be good, such as in Syria and Yemen, some of them actually just settled, intermarried with local people, and just becoming Chinese in a sense.
Also, you know, I was just thinking about what you said. Students from Yemen go to China, learn the Chinese language, and then enroll in a medical school and become doctors.
Yes.
So I was really curious as to why they would not go to the West. Is it because they don't get scholarships from the West?
Exactly. These are the Chinese government has agreements with, for example, Yemeni government or Kuwaiti government or any other government that select students to go study. Yes, I'm sure well-off kids of well-off families in Yemen, they can send their kids to US or Europe to study. Yes.
Yeah, but one of the things that happens is, if they go to the West to study, most of them stay back in the West. Does that happen with these students going to China? Do they come back and practice these professions in Yemen and other countries, or do they like to stay back in China because now they've become an integral part?
Yeah, as I said just now, yes, because the economy of Yemen or Syria are not very good, and especially actually there are wars still going on. So a lot of the students decide to just stay in China, intermarry with local people, and make a life. Yes, yes. A lot of them What about the case of language instructions in India related to Middle Eastern countries?
The story is very different with respect to India because, India hasn't really formally started any language schools in any of these places. India in the initial days was looked at as a place where Arabs went to learn English.
Oh.
This continues even now. So
not Hindi.
No,
not
no.
Oh, okay.
No.
To learn English.
To learn English because we had
British
the Empire.
Yes.
Yeah. Also, many of them went there to study medicine, not to the scale that you would have now of students from the Middle East going to China, but very few did go to India to, some of them even did school in India, like primary, secondary school in India.
That was because their parents moved over to India, or
no, they were boarding schools. So many
British
of them,
system again.
So many of them were put in boarding schools, and then they studied in India, had their primary and secondary education in India, and then they went back to the Gulf, where they had scholarships to go to the West. So this was a different kind of a trajectory. But also, most Arabs, the story may be slightly different now, but most Arabs through the 50s, 60s, 70s could speak Hindi because Hindi and Indians spoke Arabic. So in parts of Bombay and Gujarat, in Sindh particularly, Arabic was taught in school because the merchant community that went to the Gulf to finance the pearl trade and the textile, carrying textiles to the Gulf, they needed Arabic. So many of them.
This is for the Indian merchants.
This is for the Indian merchants.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. So and the Arabs picked up Hindi because it's an organic kind of a connection. So Arabic,
everyday usage.
Yes. And also both languages have lots of loan words. So
Hindi and Arabic.
Yeah. Also, other languages in Western India, like Malayalam, for instance, has loan words from Arabic, but that's a different story. So I think it came naturally to most of the Arabs in the 60s, 70s, 80s. In Dubai, it still continues, and parts of the UAE, it still continues. Whereas Kuwait, for instance, has kind of not pursued that policy. It looks at itself as more part of the Arab world, whereas Dubai and the Emirates, Oman look at themselves as part of the Indian Ocean, even to this day. And also Urdu, we should also probably talk about Pakistan in that sense. Urdu and Arabic have a similar script. It's the Turco-Persian script.
Yes. And you mentioned this Sindh area.
Yeah.
That's part of Pakistan
now.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So that's more or less the connection, and so there were no real formal schools set up to train people in Hindi or Arabic. This was mostly done in households, in merchant households, where people learnt the language, and because of their relations with other traders and other people, because they all worked in conjunction with each other for trade and then smuggling and all of that, everyone kind of picked up the language. Many may not be able to write in Arabic, or the Arabs may not be able to write in Hindi, but they speak. Also, Bollywood has had a huge role in, teaching Hindi to the Arabs, because all the Arabs in the 70s, 80s, they would play Bollywood music in their cars. They would watch Bollywood films. I mean, Saudi obviously didn't have this option because you couldn't have movies publicly viewed, but the Emirates, Oman, Bahrain, all these places had Bollywood as part of their everyday life. So I think that just flowed in. So the state didn't have to make any kind of effort in that sense. sense.
Yeah, in terms of everyday people-to-people interactions, these organic interactions is always much more fun and more natural to build up these kind of bondage and relationships. And in terms of the movie industry, definitely Jackie Chan's movies are very popular in all parts of the Middle East. I remember when I was living in Cairo, the question that I get asked most is always,
do you play?
Yes, do you play Kung Fu? I said, not all Chinese play Kung Fu. Yeah, okay. But that's always the point that intrigue people from a different culture, pique their curiosities, and if they have more initiative and energy, they will pursue these curiosities, and then in the end may, you know, build some deeper cultural connections.
Yeah. Also the context in which these songs and you know, other kinds of literary things become popular and more deeply entrenched. So both you know, the Middle East and the subcontinent have you know, as part of their wedding festivities where everybody sings and kind of dances. I mean, in the Persian Gulf, the men might not sing and dance with the women, but they do, like in India. And these songs become a matter of, you know, celebration, and you don't necessarily need to know the language, but because you have similar contexts in both these regions, then you know, you kind of pick on these songs and then add more flavor to your own particular wedding or party or whatever. Yeah, I think that's why Bollywood could make this huge impact on Persian Gulf countries. Yeah.